You know, we've all been there. You sign a document, you shake on a deal, and you think everything is crystal clear. But then, something goes wrong. So today, we're going to peel back the layers of what a contract really is. We're going to go from the simple promises we see on the surface to the powerful, complex legal engine that's running underneath it all.
I mean, this is the dream, right? This is how we all wish contracts worked. Just a simple, clean exchange. I do this for you, you do that for me. It feels fair, it makes perfect sense. But let's be honest, in the real world, this simple idea is almost always where the trouble begins.
Because just think about it for a second. This simple view completely ignores the questions that actually cause the fights. When exactly is A supposed to be delivered? How is the job supposed to be done? And here's the big one. What on earth happens if one person just doesn't follow through? These aren't minor details, you know. They are the battlegrounds where legal disputes are won and lost.
So why does that simple A for B idea fall apart so easily? Well, it's because almost every contract, even the ones that cost a fortune in legal fees, is incomplete. They've got gaps, they've got fuzzy language. But here's the twist. That's not a bug, it's a feature. And it's exactly why we have a whole system for figuring out what the real terms of the deal actually are.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to bust that simple contract myth. Then, we'll look inside the four corners of the actual document. We'll see how courts fill in the blanks and what happens when the words themselves just aren't enough. And finally, we'll wrap up with why all of this is, quite literally, everything in contract law. Okay, so let's start with this huge misunderstanding. Believing a contract is just a simple promise is kind of like thinking a car is just four wheels and a steering wheel. You're completely missing the engine, the whole thing that actually makes it go.
Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty, we got to do a quick reality check. None of what we're talking about today matters if there isn't a legally valid contract in the first place. You need that basic foundation, an offer, an acceptance, and something lawyers call consideration, which is really just a fancy way of saying both sides have to give something up. Think of it like a launch pad. If we've got that, we're cleared for takeoff.
So let's say a dispute ends up in court. Where does a judge even begin to figure out what two people actually agreed to? Well, they don't start by listening to voicemails or reading old emails. They start with the one thing they can trust, the document itself.
And this brings us to a fundamental legal idea called the four corners rule. It's pretty much what it sounds like. Imagine drawing a box around the edges of the physical contract. The very first step is to find every possible answer inside that box, using only the words the parties actually wrote down.
But what happens when the answers aren't in the document? Well, courts don't just throw up their hands and guess. They follow a very specific, logical playbook to find the truth. And this hierarchy right here, this is our guide for the rest of this explainer. We're going to walk through it step by step.
So let's get into it. We're going to start building this contract from the ground up, starting with the most powerful terms of all, the ones written in black and white, and, believe it or not, the ones the law sometimes writes in for you. First up, at the very top of the food chain, you have express terms. These are the promises staring you right in the face. The words you literally said or wrote down. Payment is due in 30 days. The car must be red. It's clear, it's direct. This is the absolute bedrock of the agreement, and it almost always wins.
Okay, but what about those gaps we talked about? What happens when the contract is totally silent on a really important issue? This is where things get really interesting. Courts can actually add terms to the contract to fill in the blanks. But hold on, they're not just making stuff up. These implied terms come from very specific places, all designed to figure out what the parties probably intended all along.
So where do these terms come from? Well, there are a few key sources. You have laws like the Uniform Commercial Code that provide default rules for business deals. There are implied warranties that guarantee a basic level of quality. And then there's the big one, the duty of good faith and fair dealing. That's a powerful, unwritten rule in every single contract that basically says, hey, you can't try to cheat the other person.
And to show you how powerful these gap fillers are, check this out. Under the UCC, which covers contracts for stuff, goods, you can have a perfectly binding contract even if you forgot to write down the price. No joke. The law just steps in and says the price will be a reasonable price at the time of delivery. Courts will also look at your own behavior. Coercive performance is all about how you two have been acting under this specific contract. Have they been late with payments every month and you never complained? That matters. Then there's coercive dealing, which looks at your history. How did you handle this in the last 5 deals you did together? Your past actions can absolutely define your current obligations.
And finally, there's usage of trade. This is basically the unwritten rules of the game for a specific industry. For example, if you're in the lumber business, everybody knows a 2x4 isn't actually 2 inches by 4 inches. That industry shorthand becomes part of your contract because anyone in that business is expected to know the lingo.
Okay, so we've laid out the written terms and the terms the law can add for us. But what happens when the words themselves are the problem? Or what about when someone says, "Yeah, but you promised me something totally different on the phone before we signed"? Now we're getting into the really tricky stuff.
This brings us to a huge, really important legal concept called the peril evidence rule. The best way to think about it is like a fortress wall built around the final written contract. It's the rule that acts as a gatekeeper, often blocking people from bringing up old emails or prior conversations to change the deal. It's a massive topic, but for now, just know it's the law's way of saying, if it was so important, it should have been in the final document.
The other classic problem is ambiguity. You know, when a word or phrase could reasonably mean two different things. Does delivery by Tuesday mean this coming Tuesday or Tuesday of next week? When that happens, courts don't just flip a coin. They have a whole toolkit of rules to figure out what the most likely intended meaning was.
And all of this leads us to our final and honestly most crucial point. After all of this detailed analysis, why does digging into the terms of a contract matter so much?
Here it is, the bottom line. Every single thing that can happen in a contract dispute, everything, flows from its terms. You can't even begin to argue that someone breached the contract until you know exactly what they were supposed to do. You can't calculate damages until you know what was promised and not delivered. Defining the terms isn't just step one, it's the whole ballgame.
And look, this isn't just some abstract thing for lawyers to argue about. It's a way of thinking that can protect you every single day. So I'll leave you with this question. The next time you agree to something, whether it's a multi-million-dollar deal or just a handshake agreement with a friend, stop and ask yourself, what are the gaps here? What are the unwritten rules we're both assuming? What terms are we leaving unsaid?